At the end of the day, Tasteland is a podcast about the mortifying ordeal of being
A big,
known.
yeah.
And let me tell you, it is mortifying.
Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of the mortifying ordeal of being known, you and I got in a little bit of a fight last week after the episode ended.
About the audio?
No, it wasn't a fight. It was a disagreement. So Francis says that when I when I want to ask a question that he wrote down in the notes, I
Mhm.
always credit him for the question. And he was saying, you don't have to credit me as coming up with the question.
Yeah,
But I mean, we should ask Elise about this.
that is a good question. Yeah.
Part of why I do that is because I feel like part of your intellectual property in journalism is the quality of your research and the quality of the questions that you come
Yeah.
up with. And I feel like it's ethical for me to credit you with a question that you come up with because I think of it as your basically your
Mhm.
property, like the same as your writing.
Mm.
Um, but you were trying to say this is a collaboration, this is a collaborative effort, we're in this together, so you don't have to do that. And I thought that was a very interesting perspective.
My whole thing there is like the experience for the guest and for the listener, right? Where it's like I am sacrificing my, intellectual property at the altar of the guest and listener experience to try to make it a more seamless thing where, they're like, right? Like to me that makes sense. Though I respect your respect for the journalistic integrity of the intellectual property of research and question formulation.
Thank you. Well, do you think, I mean, we should ask our listeners.
We
Can
should.
you guys tell us if it's bad for the listener experience
Mhm.
when I said Francis wants to ask before asking a question?
Yeah, listener, mail in to tastelandpod@gmail.com with
Should
your
we do a
answers.
mailbag? Should we do a mailbag episode? I feel like
We
that would be
should.
really fun around the holidays.
That would be
Instead of
fun.
writing to Santa, you can write to us and ask us questions
Yeah,
about really anything. I would say like we're pretty much experts in everything, so don't hold back.
that would be good we should do that for like a holiday episode.
Mhm.
Yeah.
100%. And I'm going to come on this thing with a sequin Santa hat.
Mhm. Wait, another thing I want to talk about that I just saw this morning is a new independent media outlet that has just
Oh, I
popped
saw
up.
that too.
Hearing
I'm really
things.
excited. Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Super cool. In the vein of I think a Hell's Gate or is it Hellgate or a 404 Media, which are all like so one interesting thing about this
Are
for
they
me.
doing a collective model? I didn't read the editor letter.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
so these are all three separate worker owned publications, but they're kind of run. So they use Ghost. Is it's which Ghost is like another
Mhm.
newsletter first like publishing tool. Um, they use that, but what's interesting about it is there's this other company in between
Lead.
called
Did I
no
tell you about this?
no it's not Lee. It's like out was it Outpost? I was just Outpost, yeah. So Outpost.pub. I was checking them out. So this is interesting because they basically are a like co-op. They're a publishers cooperative. So 404 is on them.
Mhm.
The Lever, Tangle, the Vallejo Sun, Hellgate. Um, uh, now hearing things, and it's interesting because it's like a service provider, I guess, built on Ghost, but it's this guy who worked for Wired for like a decade, who like wrote for Wired for like a decade,
Mhm.
um, who runs it. I don't know. It's maybe I don't know enough about it to get into it right now, but I will say it is nice to see another independent worker owned uh, publication rise from the ashes of. I think some of these people were laid off from Pitchfork like a
Yeah,
year, 9 months ago. It was
absolutely. Hold on to your butts, Pitchfork.
hmm
And we might even have an opportunity in an upcoming episode to talk about worker
some of these
owned
things. Stay
media
tuned, listener.
collectives. Stay tuned.
Do you okay? So speaking of Pitchfork, I was thinking about last night how the computer is now so much a work tool for me, whereas I mean, obviously in college,
Computer, famously a work tool for
famously
many people.
well,
Hmm.
okay, no, but I was thinking about it in the sense of like music and like music consumption, where now I'm on Spotify. I use Spotify, and I think I brought this up recently, where I was like, okay, like music quality, whatever. I'll try Apple Music, get the 3 months free. So I've been trying to use Apple Music, but it's hard because like I don't remember what I listened to or like when somebody asks me like, "What have you been listening to?" and I'm like, "Well, let
Mm.
me pull up my phone, open up Spotify." I don't remember what I've been listening to. Um, but the computer is a work tool, I just mean that like when I was still working in like kitchens, so like the first couple of years of my 20s, I the computer wasn't a work tool. It was a leisure tool where I would like
Mm.
after work I would go home and open up my like 10 music blogs or whatever that I looked at to find new music. Um, do you like actively find new music anywhere, or do you just use like the streamers?
So you feel like having an email job has made you more lazy about your music consumption?
Uh, it's not. That's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is I don't have time for it, and like I've got other leisure activities. Like I've got to watch the football on Saturdays.
Yeah, I go in and out of being really proactive about discovery. I do look at stuff that Spotify suggests.
Hmm.
There's people I follow on social media where if they like tweet about a song, I'll like bookmark it
Oh
and
yeah,
then come back to it later and like go check it out on Spotify. Yeah, and because I put together monthly playlists for Dirt, I always want it to be like have like fresh stuff in there.
yeah. Oh, true. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, but I will say recently I've been really busy and not listening to as much new music, but that's just
Yeah.
like a cyclical thing.
So Spotify, Apple Music.
Mhm.
One place that I don't really find new music these days is on the radio. Um, which our guest today, big radio person. Who are we talking to?
So our guest today is Elise Pepple, and she is the director of Marfa Public Radio. She's had a long history in radio, particularly public radio, and we're super interested in hearing about the experience of running a local radio station, especially in a place as unique as Marfa. And Francis just got back from Marfa, so it's definitely going to be a rich
It's
conversation.
definitely on the mind. All right, Elisa's here. Let's let her in.
Hi,
Hello.
Hi, good
good
morning.
morning.
It's nice to see you both.
Yeah,
Thank
hello. Nice
you.
to meet you.
This is funny because Elise and I have actually met in person, and Francis and I have never met in
Yeah.
person. And we've been
Hmm.
hosting this podcast for several months.
This is episode 11, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Lucky
This is
11.
also funny because I'm wearing the dress that I wore to the Murrow Awards last night.
Oh.
Mm.
And definitely I'm hurting this morning from our after party.
So, did you sleep in the dress or are you just getting home?
Just getting home.
I got home at 3 a.m.
Oh my God. I didn't know you guys throw down like that.
I didn't know we would either. Yeah.
Public radio is 24/7.
Crazy. Exactly.
No, that's very cool. I love that.
The Murrow Awards. I hadn't heard of this until I was looking up Marfa Public Radio and looking you up. You guys have won a brace of them. You've won like dozens of these awards. What are these awards?
We have. What are they? They're one of the highest honors in journalism.
Okay. In like radio specifically, broadcasting, like
Yeah, media, it's like TV and radio.
okay, yeah. I was
Yeah.
I was on the website earlier, the Murrow or is the RTDNA, Radio Television Digital News Association website. And
Rolls off the tongue.
it
right?
really does. But no, but there was this extremely long speech that Murrow gave called Wires and Lights in a Box, which is about like the responsibility of the media to the public and hard-hitting journalism, etc. But I thought it worth noting that he gave that speech exactly 66 years ago today.
Whoa, crazy.
So I did do him the favor of reading 3,000 some of the 4,000 some words that it was. It was really
Wow.
It was really long.
It's very impressive,
You might be
Francis.
the only one.
Who's ever read it, yeah.
Gold
That was
star.
stirring. Mhm.
Well, so Francis just got back from Marfa. So
You did?
I did. I was there for a wedding a week ago.
Where did they get married?
They got married in the St. Paul's Episcopal, but the pre-wedding
Cool.
party was in the arena at Chinati. So I asked my friend if he knew you or knew of you or what he knew of Marfa Public Radio, and he said that he knows Yvonne,
Uh-huh.
who's the station director. What's her role?
She's the station manager.
Okay, yeah. And then he
Yeah.
said he lived there for a couple years after college too, working at Chinati, but that he was a big fan of Billy and Joni's show and BB's show.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Small
Anyways,
town.
lovely town.
Small town. Yeah.
Do
So small.
do you live between there and Brooklyn?
Right now, that's what I do. Yeah.
Mhm.
I lived there full time for 7 years. And
Wow.
then after the pandemic, I was like, okay, I need some things that don't exist in a 2,000 person
After
town.
7 years.
Yeah.
And where were you before Marfa?
I was in Portland, Maine.
Mhm. Oh, big main head
Mm-hmm.
here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Really?
Well,
well,
Daisy.
me. I'm actually
Daisy.
driving.
Yes.
I'm driving
Yes.
back up this afternoon. If you want
Oh,
to,
you
if you want to
are.
meet in Bath, or if you want to ride, just hop on Metro North. You can come up with me. I'll drop you
Okay.
in Bath. So Francis, have you heard of? Is it the Salt Institute? Is that what it's called?
The Salt Institute. I had
Mhm.
not heard of this.
Elise, do you want to explain what it is?
Sure. The Salt Institute existed for like, I don't know, 50 years, but eventually it became where people learned how to make public radio and podcasts. Because there wasn't like, I would say 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that is where if you were getting into public radio or podcasting, that's where you would train.
Mhm.
And it's changed since then, but
So that was in Portland, Maine. And
Mhm.
I heard about it a lot when I was in college. There were a lot of alumni that worked in media who had gone through the SALT Institute. I feel like I remember looking at the site at one point and being like, should I do this? But when I interned at NPR twice in DC, and that was my first entry point into um, like the NPR network
Mm.
and the difference between like local radio stations that run autonomously, but then they will, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, like license stuff that's produced by NPR headquarters in DC and like vice versa. But the programming is independently produced, which I think a lot of people just think NPR is this one like
Monolith.
Mothership.
exactly. But I interviewed to continue working at a lot of these local radio stations. I think the furthest flung one that I interviewed at was Hawaii Public Radio. And I think I
Whoa.
got to like the top few candidates. And it's interesting to think about how different my life would have been. But I was never strong producing the audio. My role as an intern was on like the digital side and social media management. So that would have been my entry point into these independent stations. And I think eventually I would have learned more about the audio production side, but it's just not the path my life took. But you were in Alaska at some point at Alaska Public Radio. How early in your career was that?
It was at the beginning,
Mhm.
but I did it. I think a lot of people, yeah, like working in radio in a rural place is an entry point.
Mm.
But I was already living in Alaska, and then I had moved from Brooklyn to Alaska, and I lived in this 200 person town, and I lived everybody I
Mhm.
lived near. And so StoryCorps had started when I was in Brooklyn, and then I called StoryCorps and said, like, you should record stories in Alaska. And so they hired me to produce and record a series of interviews in Alaska. So I got my start in Alaska, but with StoryCorps
Mhm.
based in Brooklyn. And then I started working with the radio stations in Alaska.
I was listening to another podcast you were on, and you were talking about how when you started doing that, it was like this kind of weird thing where you were talking to somebody for a story, and he was like, "Oh yeah, Nat Geo talked to me last week, and Smithsonian
Yeah.
like the week before."
Yeah.
That's like because I feel people want you got let's go to the ends of the earth, let's go to Alaska to
Yeah.
get those stories, but then like everyone's having that same thought. I don't know. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I think also I was talking about like being a white person and recording stories in indigenous communities. Yeah, like I think StoryCorps is something that like in Brooklyn, everyone was like, "Oh my God, I love StoryCorps."
Mhm.
But it's more complicated when you're going to a place that has been colonized more recently.
Yeah.
So there was this elder who lived in this village called Shishmaref, and it's like a place where the village will have to be relocated because of the sea level
Wow.
rising.
Mm.
And so, everybody was interviewing him. He's like, yeah, Smithsonian, yeah, Nat Geo. I don't care about you. It's like, fair enough.
Yeah. Well, it's like you got to produce the stories for the millions of people back in Brooklyn, and it's like this one way kind of thing. So Alaska, Marfa, to a lesser extent Maine. Why are you you seem really drawn to these like kind of remote places? I'm curious about this.
It's like Alaska. It's all the far reaches, right?
Yeah.
Alaska, Maine, and then Marfa. Why am I drawn to them? Ooh, I mean, like,
not to like put you on the psych chair.
If this were therapy, yeah.
It sort of is. We both used this as therapy.
Yeah. Well, I think I was real lucky to live in big cities. I grew up in Baltimore, and then I lived in Montreal, Paris, New York. And then when I became a park ranger, I moved to this town of 200 people, 300 people. And I grew up in a really big family. My mom's one of 12. I'm one of 4.
And she's a twin.
And I'm a twin.
Oh, wow.
And so what I found living in a small town is that it's like living with your family. And so I loved it. I think it's funny, people who live in cities are often like, you must be so lonely in a rural place. But if you were, it's the opposite. It's like wherever you go, you say hi to everyone. People stop by. I mean, I used to wake up in the cabin that I lived in, and my neighbor would like be on my bed next to me with a cup of coffee. She'd be like, "Hi, good morning."
Let myself in.
Yeah. Which I like. Yeah. Other people don't like that. Yeah.
So it's this like sense of community. I feel like too, like that's like what a local public radio station is about, and like that's why it's so important. Like even just being when I was in Marfa for this wedding, like the sense of community was very palpable in various ways, but like for example, we're like setting up chairs in this church for the wedding, and we needed more chairs, so the pastor or whatever called up like
Vicar Wallens, Mike Wallens.
Mike, great guy.
Mike.
Anyways, he called up like another church that was a block away, and they're like, "Oh, you guys have some chairs in the basement, right?" So me and the groom and another friend went over, and like we grabbed them, and we were talking to the lady who came over, and like I don't know, I didn't grow up religious, but my parents, were raised religious, abandoned it, etc. So that the whole church world is foreign to me. But I thought, I was like, I can see like hear how important that is in this. You're in the middle of nowhere, and there's like 1,700 people in this town. You got Alpine with like 6,000 people. That's a half hour away, etc. But my point being is like I think to me, I'm guessing part of the appeal of like working in public radio in a place like Marfa is like that you're like strengthening and reproducing this sense of community. And I'm curious about like what, I don't know, how that work. Talk about the community building work of public radio in a place like Marfa.
So I think, and Daisy and I talked about this, it's like what you have to understand, and I think in urban context, this is hard to imagine, but in a rural place like Marfa, there isn't cell service all the time, and there isn't internet all the time. And so the radio is still a lifeline to people. I mean, when you can't access information, you turn on the radio. If there's a wildfire and you need to know what's happening, you turn on the radio. And so, I think, the world is changing, and like people are on their phones, and so it's hard to imagine, but radio in rural places is still this kind of essential service. And I think the other thing about it is like, you've been there, like it's a remote place, and each town is really far from the next. And radio is kind of like the companion for people, and it's one of the things that I love about public radio is that it's a connector. And people feel a sense of community through their station. Like people, whether you're in Brooklyn or Marfa, like people have their tote bag that says like Marfa Public Radio or WNYC or WBEZ, because people feel a sense of community with their station.
And I think, this a little bit goes back to talking to Indigenous people in Alaska and sort of towing this line of like making sure their narratives are just not for outsider consumption. But because of the small population in Marfa and the fact that most local radio stations are funded by a combination of donations and grants, you have a much smaller pool of people to give give donations that are directly in the community. And so one thing that we talked about is, obviously it's programming by the community for the community, but there are a lot of people who come through Marfa as tourists, and creating a relationship to them where they feel a connection to Marfa and could potentially want to continue to fund the work that Marfa Public Radio does creates a scenario where, by nature of that market and the extended far-flung community of people that have special memories of Marfa or connections to it, that there is some amount of programming that's also created for outsider consumption as well. And can you talk about how that ties into the business model?
Sure. Yeah, I want to say three things. So we just last night won a National Murrow Award for our podcast, Marfa for Beginners.
Congratulations. It's amazing.
Huge.
Thank you. And one of the reasons to make that podcast, there's like 17 reasons, but one was to say, this station exists in a population undense area. And the business model of public radio is really membership, right? Like, so stations in cities have millions of people listening, and so they have thousands of supporters. But when you're located in a place like Marfa, there are just less people, so you don't have the critical mass of millions of people and thousands of donors. For us, I'll listen to a pledge drive for a station in a city, and they're like, we have 10,000 new members. For us, we're like 300, please. Like, we just need 300. So with Marfa for Beginners, one of the thoughts to me was, how do we make some kind of content that reaches people who visit this place? Because there are 2,000 residents of Marfa, but there are 60,000 visitors to Marfa. So can we start to
that's like
have
the yearly
people
number.
relate? Well, nobody really keeps track, but that's one. That was a number a couple years ago. So how do we get people to relate to the station? And is it possible for people who visit to support the radio station? I guess, and I wanted to say like two other things. First, the thing that's amazing about public radio, like NPR, any station, is that the mission of public radio is to solve local problems and lift the human spirit. And I just like, in the media ecosystem that we are in, it's like, what media outlet says we're here to lift the human spirit in these days? And if you go back to that mission statement, which is long, but there's a quote that I often think of that's like, we will regard people and differences with joy rather than derision, and rather than hate. And it's like, that's wild. Like, it's a wild, beautiful mission. So whether it's NPR National or a member station, I think that's very special. For our radio station, though, it's like, we're out here trying to make that happen with a small team around the clock, and then funding it because of its location is challenging. It's just challenging.
Do you get some of those, like some of the the passers through, like funding, like committing to the pledge drive?
We do now. Yeah, we do. It used to be, and for most stations, people give to their home station, right? So our members historically have been people who live in the Big Bend and the Permian Basin. But in this, basically one of the experiments to me is to say like, okay, there's going to always be a ceiling. So yeah, can we get people to join? And so it's kind of unusual. Like, I would say, it's not normal to have members from other places.
Yeah.
But our last pledge drive, I'd say almost 50% of our members live in places that are not
Oh,
Marfa.
wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And with the success of Marfa for Beginners, do you think you'll continue to create programming that's specifically targeted towards people that feel an affinity for Marfa but don't live there?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because when we made the podcast, we had like a list of principles of where we would come from in our
Mhm.
work. One, Marcel Duchamp said, "Don't give all your secrets away."
Mm.
And so one of our goals in making like a quote unquote local podcast was to not give the town secrets away.
Mm.
But we also, it's like, so how do we tell these stories without like saying we're the truth or
Mhm.
like we know what's up, um, or saying like here's the authentic Marfa, whatever. That's a problematic phrase, but and then another principle was to be making something that like people who lived in Marfa would love
Mhm.
and people who didn't live in Marfa would love. So we call it a tourism podcast for locals. And we were meeting with PRX, who we love, and they do such great work in podcasts. And they were like, no, like you can't market to these two very different audiences. And we were like, but that's what we're
That's the
going to
whole
do.
thing. Mhm.
And they were like, no, because they're smart. They're like, no, you have to choose one audience and, you know, figure out what you're doing for that audience. And what's so crazy is it ended up working. You
Mhm.
know, we made this podcast, and it's one of the things that people who live in the broadcast area are like, oh, I love this. And then it's also something that people who don't live in the area listen to. Um, we just got nominated for an award for best road trip podcast, and so I guess, you know, that would be like for visitors.
Mhm.
um and then into the future, Daisy, I guess like what we're trying to think about is how to make our content to replicate that model where it's like we want this content to speak to people, our neighbors, and we also want it to speak to this national audience. So our latest project is a newsletter, which is called the Desert Dispatch, and it's kind of like a version of Marfa for Beginners, where in the newsletter Zoe Curlin is the producer of this newsletter. There's like a
Dirt contributor.
dirt contributor. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right.
Shout out to Zoe.
Zoe's so talented. And so in that newsletter, every week there's like a kind of slice of life of West Texas.
Mhm.
And it could be going to a gem and mineral show. It could be going to like a bat emergence at a cave that's a national park. It could be going to Midland, which is part of the oil patch, and like looking at it from a sociological level. So yeah, it's like this way to look at the content, as both local and national.
Mhm.
I love bats and minerals, so I would love all of that.
You have to read, oh my gosh, Zoe's essay on the Great Bat Emergence is poetic. I will
We
send it
should
to you.
syndicate. We'll talk off mic.
Well, wait, one thing you were talking about Midland. I was looking at the broadcast area for Marfa Public Radio, and there's kind of the big major one is this Marfa Fort Davis area, and then there's Alpine, Marathon, Presidio, Midland, and Odessa as these kind of like separate broadcast areas. And so, I mean, for the listeners, this is like hundreds of miles of radius around it. But then these other places were these much smaller kind of broadcast areas. Does Marfa Public Radio kind of like serve as also like the singular local radio station for some of these other areas, or is there another radio station there? I'm imagining there's not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Marfa Public Radio has 5 transmitters, and we broadcast to an area that is the size of South Carolina. So to
Mm.
drive you can drive for 5 hours through our signal.
Mm.
So even though it's called Marfa Public Radio for this tiny town, it's really
West
West
Texas, yeah.
Texas's
Mm.
public radio.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Another so when I was there, I did have coffee and a sandwich at the Sentinel, and I'm curious if my impression is that like this is kind of this cafe that is part of a way of funding this local newspaper. Am I right, or is that just like the name of it is the same as the newspaper, or is this like kind of being in that cafe? It feels like I'm in like Say Coffee in East Williamsburg or something like that.
It's very
Yeah.
hip.
Yeah.
It's very hip. It's very beautiful. Yeah, I was just there, I don't know, 3 days ago.
Mhm.
It's a great place to hang out. And yeah, I think I can't speak to like how their business
Yeah.
model
Mm-hmm.
works, because I don't have the details. I can tell you all about my
Yeah.
P&L and
Well, no,
like
Yeah.
just
what
But
like
you guys are sort of like coexisting
yeah.
pillars of different
yeah,
mediums. Is that
yeah.
fair to say?
Yeah. And so I think what they're trying to do, or what their kind of premise was um can we support media by having this coffee
Mm-hmm.
shop? Yeah.
Yeah. Just thought it was interesting. I hadn't really seen that before.
Yeah, yeah,
I bought a
totally.
t-shirt. It says print isn't dead.
Mhm.
It's a great t-shirt.
um, well, now I need a Marfa Public Radio t-shirt, or maybe even a tote
Maybe a
bag.
tote bag.
So keep it,
Yeah,
yeah,
maybe both.
maybe
Yeah,
both.
yeah.
Um, what? So you mentioned, obviously, I think we sort of touched on creating joy or lifting the human spirit,
Mhm.
but obviously local problems. Those local problems probably are, sort of separate from the types of topics that are in Marfa for Beginners. But could you talk a little bit about like what local reporting has been the most impactful over the last year for you guys?
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess I'll think about it in the last 8 years,
Mm.
because
Mm.
that's on election night. I'll have my 8 year
Oh wow.
anniversary. Yeah,
Ooh.
wild day to start running a
Mm-hmm.
radio
The more
station.
things change,
Um,
etc.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So I think there are a couple things in terms of reporting. It's like what I was saying about wildfires, like if there's a wildfire and people need to hear what's happening. I mean, and I guess this also overlaps with how the station serves a place like Marfa and a place like Midland. Our motto is radio for a wide range, and it's kind of, I think, it's fair to say that public media can be an echo chamber, or there's a certain audience for public media. But because of our broadcast range, we really are reaching very different communities.
Mhm.
Midland is very different from Marfa. And so we have listeners who aren't necessarily typical public radio listeners. And so I'll never forget, in one of the wildfires, we basically we're reporting nonstop, right? We're just like on the air telling people like, this is what's happening, this is what you need to know. And it's kind of like serving this function of just saying like, we're here with you,
Mhm.
we're here with you, this is the information. And we were going out, Sally and I were going out to meet with the firefighters every morning at sunrise. She hated it because we started like Facebook living this
Mm.
years ago, and she was like, I didn't sign up for this. um, and so, but I remember going to the public library in Fort Davis, and there was a mama, and there were 6 kids, and they were like stair step, their heads were like stair steps just like next to each other at these computers. And so I was talking to this mama, and these 6 kids turn around, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And she homeschools her kids, and she's a rancher, and she said like, oh, thank you. Like
Mm.
we wouldn't know where the fire line is because we don't have internet, so we listen to the radio to know where the fire line is and that we're safe. Um, yeah, that's
You had said something a minute ago about the NPR listener isn't the average public radio listener. What does that mean? What is the average public radio listener?
I mean, I can't exactly say, but I
Yeah.
think we can all
Not the
agree that
stereotype of it, at least as it's
yeah,
understood in the public imagination and memes of, soy
yeah.
coffee,
Yeah.
tote bag,
Uh-huh.
Brooklyn,
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
somehow
Yeah.
have a New Yorker tote on one arm and an
Yeah.
NPR tote on the other
Yeah.
one.
Mhm.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
hipster.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But public service and programming for that type of person is very different from what you're describing, which is like could not be more of a public service. You're
Right.
reporting on people's health, safety, climate, um, which we all experience, but in this market is different. And
Right.
I want to make sure that we ask, and if you want to elaborate a little bit more on the funding model. I think we got pretty good, like, broad strokes. But
Mhm.
if people are listening to this, I know you have been in a pledge drive period. Like, what's the best way that they could support Marfa Public Radio?
Oh, thank you, Daisy, for asking. We just started our pledge drive yesterday.
Uh-huh.
And so, basically, because we're in a place that's population undense, um, to become a member is a way to have a huge impact for our station. Like, if you can imagine it, if we have 300 people who care about Marfa Public Radio give in this pledge drive, like that will sustain it's 1/15 of our budget, so the best way to support the station is to become a member. And I think, yeah, I don't know that people think about that, but the broad strokes of our fundraising, most radio stations are about 50% funded from members. But again, if you have millions of people, that works. But if you have a couple 100,000 people in Midland and 2,000 people in Marfa, maybe 20,000 people in the Big Bend, there's a limited opportunity. There's definitely a plateau. So yeah, for people who are listening, to become a member is a way to have a huge impact.
Mhm. How many people work for the station, like full time, part time? What's the human labor that goes into like keeping this thing going?
Whew. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I feel like this is so obvious, but when I say it, people are like, "Oh, I forgot about that." And I forgot it. My first day on the job, which was election night 2016, I was like, "Right. This is a nonprofit that never closes. Radio stations never close.
Mhm.
They operate 24/7. Um, and the news cycle is always breaking. And since 2016, it broke and broke and broke over and over again, with more rapidity.
Mhm.
So before I tell you how many people work at the radio station, I also just want to say, like, it is a crazy nonstop effort. And our team has been changing, because of where we're located. We're a small team. A lot of us, including me, didn't have a background in the role that we've had. I had never run a radio station. I produced audio. And so right now we have, I think it's 7 full-time staff members and 3 part-time staff members. And that's to do everything.
Mhm.
That's, the broadcast engineering, that's the reporting, that's podcasts, that's fundraising, that's admin. It's all the things.
Mm.
Everybody wears like 5 hats. Every job is like slash this.
Yeah.
Mm.
Speaking of podcasts, I read on the website that you started this thing, NPR Studios, a couple of years
Mhm.
ago, which I understood reading it as this sort of initiative to produce both broadcast and podcast stories. But this is, I think, what Welcome to Marfa comes out of. What is NPR Studios?
I mean, we don't really need a name for it.
Mhm.
It's easier to talk about with a name.
Yeah.
It's really, but it's an approach
Okay.
to public media. And I think there was a time where radio stations were like, "Oh, podcast studios. We should have a podcast.
Mm.
People are doing that. Let's get in on that."
Mhm.
And I guess I just thought that was a limited perspective. That was before podcasting kind of tanked.
Yeah.
But I thought it was the wrong way to think about it, because part of our power in public media is the broadcast. And so to just say, "Oh, we're going to have some podcasts, let's get in on podcasts," doesn't really make sense. I think we have to reimagine all of public media. And so that includes podcasts and broadcasts. And so, like, an example, we do these 2, what I would call like on-air rituals, where for Valentine's Day, the town of Valentine is,
Drove through
next
it.
to Marfa.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So for Valentine's Day, we do this thing called the Love Drive, and it's for love, not for money. And we broadcast people's love notes on the air. And so that's like a broadcast. It's annoying to say this, but it's like a broadcast experiment. And that is part of the studio thinking, is to say, how do we use any transmission tool, whether it's broadcast or podcast, to create like a special sense of belonging and meaning for people? So we do that for love. We do that for death. For Dia de los Muertos, we do an honor ofrenda. And so, yeah, just to think about, rather than like kind of myopically saying, oh, podcasts will solve our problems. It's like, no, we have to reimagine all of public media. And that's both
What is
podcasts and
so
podcasts.
thinking of the word podcast here, it's like I mean, radio, you record stories and it's like serialized stories and like publish them anyways. Like what's the is that just a podcast? Like what's the difference between a podcast and like a produced serialized radio show? Is there one?
Not necessarily. I mean, you can just put it in both
Yeah.
locations. I would say the difference is like I'm pretend holding my phone. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
But you listen to
podcasts
it.
are your phone radio,
Yeah.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Phone radio on demand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Love, Death, and Taxes, evergreen programming. So to be a little bit more specific about becoming a member, what does that mean? What do people give? What do they get? Obviously, they get an uplifted spirit, but
Yeah, it's like a Visa commercial. It's
Yeah.
priceless to become a
Yes.
member of Marfa
course,
Public Radio.
of course.
Yeah, so you would just go on our website, marfapublicradio.org, and you can click the donate button. You could call us, you could look us up on Instagram, just the name Marfa Public Radio. And you can give kind of at any level, right? And part of the beauty of public media is that like a donation of $5, we consider that as meaningful as a donation of $1,000.
Mhm.
And so we have that range, right? Like I remember being on the air and someone pulled their big rig over and just like jumped out and handed me $5. And it's like, so it's like super moving for anyone to contribute to the station. And then for people who have more means, it's like, yeah, if you can give $1,000 to this radio station, that's huge. And what do people get? We, Daisy, not that the bar is high, but we have the best merch in public radio. Everybody says it.
Mhm.
We have really cool, whether it's like t-shirts, bandanas, mugs, we have the best looking merch. And so what a person gets when they become a member is some really cool merch. And then the other thing that's just true is that like in the public media system, this station is a gem. Like there really isn't, and I'm not allowed to say this because I run the station, but
You're allowed. We'll allow it.
okay, you're supporting one of the gems of public media. So when you become a member of Marfa Public Radio, it's just like you're supporting this critical lifeline service, you're supporting creativity, you're supporting what I would say is like a really forward-thinking approach to how public media can exist in this day and age. But yeah, I don't know if that's a compel. I don't know if that's
okay. You're talking about how it's one of the gems in public media, one of the best public radio stations. You are on the NPR board of directors, correct? One of 12 member station seats on the board. Tell us more about like what that is and what you do there, and I don't know how you then interact with like the broader national public radio system.
Yeah, you've done your research. Yes. So I serve on the NPR National Board, and like you said, it's a combination of CEOs from radio stations and other members of the board. And really, the point is so because a listener doesn't get this, but we talked about this at the beginning. NPR is not a mothership to stations. I wish it were. Like, I wish there was just one organization and everything was worked out. I wish we didn't have to have an engineering department, a membership department, all the things. But so what's wild about how public media started is that stations are separate from NPR National. And as Daisy was explaining, it's like NPR creates programming that stations buy. So in terms of a business model, it's kind of insane. It's like there's 247 radio stations, each doing their own thing all over the country. And then with NPR National, to be on that board is to kind of lend the perspective of public radio stations to the NPR National Board as an organization. And so it's this great opportunity to help shape the leadership of that organization. It's a great opportunity to help shape the vision and strategy of that organization. and just to keep the perspective of member stations on the leadership side of NPR. And it's wild, it's wild because it's like our budget is $1.5 million, which is small for a radio station. And then to serve on a board that has a $300 million budget and 1,000 staff members, it's really amazing to kind of be like the smallest and then also get to work with the kind of the largest version of public media.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it's sort of like a feedback and maybe even sometimes accountability mechanism for them. But does that flow both ways?
Yeah, great question. NPR, because they have to make everything they do happen, we don't get support from NPR national stations don't. We get a reduced fee for the programming that we have from NPR, but it's not a relationship where, say, like, they help us raise money.
Do you are there any other peer stations that you particularly admire in other parts of the country?
Great question, Francis.
Oof, 100%. Let's see. Like the smallest stations, my heart will always be with Alaskan public radio stations, or like mountain town public radio stations, just like real rural stations, whether that's, in Sitka, Alaska, or Crested Butte, Colorado, or the North Country in the Adirondacks. And then there's some stations that are just like super special, like KXP in Seattle, like KCRW in LA. Louisville Public Media is special in Louisville, Kentucky. Yeah, it's funny. It's like there's stations that I love because what they're doing is exciting. And then there's stations that I love because I love those places. So like Daisy, I don't know if you listen to Maine Public Broadcasting, but I love Maine Public Broadcasting because I listen when I'm there. And it's like I have a couple like home stations. And then, also favorite station, WFMU. They have so much personality. They're based in Jersey City. They're an all music station. But yeah, I like the small stations, the kind of innovating stations, and the ones with like a lot of personality.
Yeah.
Do you ever get calls from other station directors saying, "Hey, I'm having this problem. I don't know how to solve it"? Like, what's the camaraderie like between these different satellites?
The camaraderie is, I'm laughing. It's like a therapeutic laugh. It's kind of like if you just like put your hand up to someone else's and you're like, I see you. I see. Well, yes, we talk, leaders of radio stations talk all the time, and it's so therapeutic. You're just like, I don't know what to do here. And you'll both like laugh and cry with each other because it is a crazy world. Yeah, I have never met more generous people. Like, two stories come to mind. One, like when I got to the radio station, my first day, I was like, as an audio producer, I was like, okay, there's going to be a manual or like a file that'll give me some outline how to run a radio station. And I got to the radio station, and there wasn't even a computer in my office. There were no documents.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, low key, how do I run a radio station?
Who needs a computer?
Low key, how do you run a radio station?
Yes. So I had looked for, like, before I got to the station, I did two things. I did like a nerdy, because I love research, a road trip where I went to like the stations that I thought were doing really exciting work, whether it was like, something like WNYC or WMMT, which is in Whitesburg, Kentucky. It's a station that's also part of Appalshop, which supports culture in Appalachia and is super important right now post the hurricane. So I did this like radio road trip. And then I also, because there aren't many women in leadership roles in public media, or there were, generally there's more men in charge. So I looked for some women who ran stations, and I reached out to them before I took the job. So I called one of them when I got to the station. I was like, oh, what do I do? And she was like my fairy godmother. She was like, Elise, you need help. And I was like, I know, I need help. And she's like, you just gotta say, help. And so there's this like email that goes to everyone who runs a radio station. And it was so embarrassing, but I literally wrote reply all, every CEO of a station in the country. I was like, hi, so I just started running Marfa Public Radio. Is there a manual anywhere about how to do this? And I got like 100 responses within an hour. And some of them were like, ha, I wish. Oh luck. God. Oh no. Yeah. So yeah, the camaraderie is amazing. Mm-hmm. Some of my closest friends are people who run other radio stations because we're all trying to solve these problems. And whether you run a station that's tiny, like Marfa Public Radio, or big, like, KCRW in LA, you're facing some of the same issues,
different scales,
no matter what size.
Yeah. So you've been in this job for 8 years. I don't really know much about the state of like radio. Like I haven't driven a car regularly since 2012. I don't know. And in as much as you have like a thermometer on the state of radio, because I'm thinking of, social media and stream, all the other ways you can spend your time. I think radio, I just think of people driving. And I don't know what like, do you worry about the health of radio as a medium? Are you optimistic about it? Like what, I'm not situated at all on the state of radio.
I love that you're asking me to comment on the state of radio. Like I'm very important.
You are.
Yeah. You know much more than me.
You're very important to us.
Oh, thank you, Daisy. So what I would say about the state of radio is like, I don't know. There's a premise in one faith that is like, you should question everything. Mm-hmm. Not, if you have faith, you should question it. And I think the same is true in any industry you're in. So I don't want to like clutch my chest and be like, will radio survive? Yeah. Because really the question is like, okay, this medium started 54 years ago, or at the time, radio was a way to approach this public service mission. Mm-hmm. And like you said, especially in the pandemic. So yeah, listening used to happen in cars. And then the pandemic changed whole other big topic to discuss. How did the pandemic change all of our lives? So yeah, what we're seeing now is that the trend is going down, that people are listening to other things. And I think that's because now it's not that we live in cars, it's that we live with our iPhones.
Yeah.
So how do you translate this public service medium to a phone, or how do you translate it to these times? And so the data right now is that listenership is down. But what I will say is overall that I think it's like 40 million people interact with public radio. So when you think of one media entity that has that audience, that's still huge. Big, that's significant. And I think the question is, how, if public media were invented in 2024 instead of in, God, can't do math this early. And
don't worry about it.
I have no idea.
1993.
Let's just say that.
It would look different. Like it wouldn't be based on broadcast technology. It would be based on TikTok, social vibes,
vibes technology,
vibe tech.
I feel like that's a perfect note to end on. I could keep talking about this forever, but
no, I think that's perfect.
Is there anything else?
I love ending on vibe technology.
This has been Tasteland. Thank you for listening. Home of Vibe Tech.